Okay, class, today we're going to review Flexbox and we're going to add in how to change the order of the items in the Flexbox when you go to mobile. So our layout is going to look like this. Very simple. We have desktop and mobile. As you can see, we have a place kind of where the logo would be up here in this yellow box, a nav with two buttons, a two-column layout, and then a footer. And then on the mobile version, we're keeping that the same. We're stacking the nav bar. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip these. So we're going to put first the pink box, and then the blue box, and then the copyright. So changing the order of things. And that's pretty common when it comes to mobile. All right, so let's go over. I already kind of took a look at the colors and added those to brackets. I know this is Helvetica and so on, so we're not as worried about that. So what you can see here is when we go to our index.html, we have our typical start. There's nothing in it, and then we go to our CSS. The only things I added were the colors, the hex colors for that, and then how we would call the font family. We can see here that we have yellow for desktop, light blue, and then yellow again. Actually, I might turn this last one to pink. How about light pink? There we go. So we have our three colors. So we know we're desktop, the breakpoint for tablet, and then mobile. You want to make sure to get rid of those colors at the end. Don't forget. All right, here we go. So let's start here with our index page, and we're going to put some of our divs in and then do the CSS. So the first thing we have at the top is that logo, and I'm going to call that the header. So it's just going to be header, open and close. That's where that's going to go. And now underneath that, I kind of want to use my Flexbox, right? So in the Flexbox, we can use to add these four different boxes. So the nav, this blue box, this magenta box, and then the footer. So I'm going to put all four of those boxes into one flex. So whenever you're doing a flex, you want to remember that you have to have one box or div that contains it all. So I'm going to make a container. And this is where the actual CSS Flexbox would go. Now, whenever I have a div, I always make a comment that says what this is closing. So this is closing the container. It gets confusing otherwise. So I know that this and this, the opening tag and the closing tag, go together. Now, in the container, I'm going to put the nav. And then I'm going to put that blue box. So I'm going to call it div class equals blue. Make a comment that this is closing blue. Again, so we don't get confused. And then one more here for the magenta. Make a comment that that's closing magenta. And then finally, I have a footer. Now, note I'm putting this all in the container. You can kind of see it's nested within. And I show that one because if I click the opening and the closing tag highlights, you can see that this is all nested within. And then I kind of give that visual cue by tabbing in for that entire section. So those are all the boxes. We need a tiny bit of content, like in the nav we need two buttons. So anything that's clickable is an ahref. And if I don't have any place for it to go yet, I can just put a pound sign in there and it'll act like a button. Even though it physically doesn't go to another page or a link, if you put the hashtag in there, it's going to act like a button. I might call that about, and then I'm going to copy it again, and I think the other one was called contact. And then in the footer, I have a copyright. So I can add the ampersand, copy, semicolon. That's going to give me the little fancy C, and then I'm going to put the word copyright. So we have a little bit of text in here. These other boxes are just blank. They're just going to have background colors in them. I have this kind of live previewing, and I always like to work maybe with half and half so I can kind of see what's going on as I type. All right, I'm going to hit save. And now that we have everything in our HTML, now we can go to our CSS and kind of give it some style. So what we have already in our CSS is I have font size 100%, which will allow me to use M's. I have the background color set as this yellow. Now the actual background color is gray, so I'm going to change that right away to my hex color. And then we have my responsive images, so think the images would scale. I'm going to add all my divs that I just added to the HTML. So if you remember, I had header, I had underneath that I did the container. Now because I used a class, it has to have a period in front of it. And then what we put nav, and then in the nav we have links. So the actual text, the word about and contact, this nav A, the A link, is how you can stylize that. The nav itself is just the box that's holding those two buttons. And then I always put the nav A hover in right away. So what it would look like when we hover over it, we have the blue box, the magenta box, and then finally the footer. And I kind of add these all right away so I know they match up with all the divs that we created on the index. So if one is in one page, it's going to go in the CSS. Maybe I won't even add anything right away, but I might add to the future in the future. All right, so the header is starting with that yellow box at the top. So what I would do is I would hop back here to Illustrator, my document, and see how big this is. So it's like 108 by 108, we'll say. So I'm going to give it a width of 108 pixels and a height of 108. Now the only time you would ever, make sure you have semicolons after each rule, the only time you would ever use absolute numbers like this instead of percentages is if it's small like that, under 300 pixels. Then we don't have to worry about the responsive size of it. And then I'm going to give it a background color of that yellow. And then what I want to do is, let's kind of look what this looks like. There it is. I want to center this. Now remember, there's only two ways to center everything. It's either margin auto or text align center. And since this isn't text or an image, it's margin auto in this specific case. All right, so that is ready to go. We're going to come back and put some margin in between, but let's go down through this first. Next up, let's go to the nav. So we have these two buttons in the nav, and if you remember over here, we have, I'm always referring back to my Illustrator document, is I have a border on the top, a border on the bottom, and then white text in, which is Helvetica 13 points, or we'll say pixels, and we're going to translate that to M's. So let's go back and add that. So in the nav itself, what we need to do is we're going to give it a width of 100%. That's what it is. It's going to take up the whole space. And we're going to add a border top. Now when we're doing border top, we want to give it how big we want it to be, how thick of a weight. So I'm going to say 2 pixels solid white. Notice there's no commas in between. It's just one after the other. And then at the same time, I want to make sure that it has the border bottom, 2 pixels, solid, white. Hop my preview back here so we can kind of see it. Perfect. And then what I need to do is I need to add a little bit of padding. So I'm going to add padding 20 pixels around. That's going to give it a little bit of that buffer. And I want to text align the center so the buttons stay in the center. Not too bad. Now let's go down to the nav A. Notice here we're not putting all our typography color in the nav. It's actually going to go in the A. This is where we could say that I want the font family to be Helvetica. I want the color of it to be white. And I don't want any text decoration. That's the underline. So to get rid of that underline there. And I'm just tabbing these in so it looks a little bit more organized. And then for a hover effect, I'll just change the color to black. So we just have a little bit of a hover effect when I come over here. Now I'm going to back up here because I want these to be evenly distributed. So what I have to do is put a Flexbox on the nav itself. So good review of Flex here. So we want to activate the Flexbox by doing display flex, flex wrap. I'm going to say wrap. This is going to come in handy when we get down to mobile, so it wraps around. Flex direction, and these are ones I always put on. You have either row or column. And then finally, I'm going to do justify content space around. And that's kind of the magic one that then evenly distributes those buttons along the nav. Looks pretty good. All right, we're going to save that. And now that nav looks about done, so we're ready to go to the next section, which is those 2 columns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back here with the container first, because this is where we actually are going to have to put the flex. Now, this container is holding, if you remember, the nav, the copyright, and those two sections. So what I'm going to do, and this is very common in the container, I'm going to give it a width of 100%, but then I'm going to give it a max width of 830 pixels. Now, where did I get that number from? If I go back here, that is the width of from here to here, 830. So I know my container that's holding everything is going to be 830 pixels. Oops, I'll jump back here. And then to center this is again where I always do margin auto. So this is kind of a very typical container strategy. Maybe this number, the max width, is going to change if you want it to be a little wider or a little not. Another trick that I sometimes do is I'll put a border around things to just kind of see how big they are. So if I just put border 5 pixels solid red, here you can see this is that box that I'm making, that container that's holding everything together. And I can change the size of that, say to 1,000 pixels to make it larger, or to 1,200, even larger yet. But no matter what, the margin auto is what's keeping that center. Okay, so let's go back to 830 because I know that's the right size for this specific document. And I'm going to come down, let's add these 2 boxes. So I'm going to give it a width. Since these are side by side, I'm going to say it's a width of 65%. And then I'm going to do a margin right of 5%, 70%, which leaves 30% on the other side, because I want these to kind of be next to each other. So we have to make sure the math adds up. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them both a height of, I'm going to say 400 pixels. Width and height. And then we can give it our background color. So I'm going to do background color, spelled it right, and do the cyan. And magenta. So there they are. We see those 2 boxes. And then finally, we still have to do the footer, and then we'll kind of flex these all together. We didn't put the flex box on yet. So down here in the footer, the only thing we really want to do is give it a width of 100%. And I'm going to do my font family again, so we know we have a Helvetica. I'm going to do text align center, just to get that center. So again, 2 ways to center things, either margin auto if it's a div, or if it's text or an image, you would do text align center. All right, last thing we have to do is add our flex to this. So we're going to go back to the container. So the flex box goes on the box that's containing all the items. I can't star that or repeat that enough. I don't need this red border anymore. So I'm going to do the same thing I did below. I'm going to do display flex, flex wrap, flex direction, row. It's the exact same thing. You could even copy and paste it. And there we go. And we don't even need to do justify because everything kind of fits up with the math that we did if we look at it here. So now these all butt up because we have this at 100%, 65, 5% margin, 30%, and then the copyright. Looks pretty good. Now, what I want to do lastly is add a little margin between things. If I look at this example here, notice there's like a little cushion around things. Things aren't like snug up against each other. So what I would do is I would add this, which would be margin, to some of these items, starting at the top. So let's go back here before we go to mobile. All right, so starting at the top with the header, I'm going to add about some margin top on top of the yellow box. So margin top, I'm going to say 20 pixels. And then add a little bit underneath, margin bottom, 20 pixels. And then on top of the blue, because see how it's touching the nav, I'm going to do margin top, 20 pixels. Once I get a number, I kind of keep it consistent. And same with the magenta. And then finally the footer, I'd probably add a little bit more to that, like 50 pixels to move that down. So I just added some margin to give it some space. All right, there we have our entire desktop. And actually, because the size is 830, which is pretty small, it works for tablet as well. So what I can do is come down here and I just need to get rid of that background color. So it goes back to the gray. Perfect. Our tablet size works well. And now we can go down to mobile. So when we get down to mobile, we want a couple things to happen. If we look here, we want this, the yellow box is fine. We want these to stack. And then we want the order, well, we want these to both be 100% and then the order to flip. So let's kind of add that in here. Let's get our page situated. Okay. And let's start here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want these to be 100%, the blue and the pink. So I'm going to add period blue. Let's do width 100%. If you remember up here, the blue is 65%. So I'm changing it now. It's overriding that 65 up at the top for mobile only, and it's going to be 100. I also want to get rid of that margin left, so I'm just going to do margin 0. And then we want the same thing for pink. So instead of doing that again, I'm just going to add to this one. I'm going to put comma pink. So it does this, oh, I didn't call it pink, I called it magenta. So it does the same thing for both. So for the magenta and the blue, it's going to make a width 100% and no margin. Perfect. Now, what we want to do is stack this nav. So I'm going to come back to the nav. And I look at what I had up here. So if you remember, I have nav 100%. We want to just change this so it's going to stack. So we're going to change the direction from flex direction row, so they're next to each other, to flex direction column. Follow that right? There we go. And that's going to stack them in place. I'm just going to give it a little bit of height so it stretches them out a little bit, like maybe 150, to change the order of things. So right now, we just want to change this from the nav blue magenta copyright to nav pink blue copyright. So what we need to do is add here our different classes and footer. And we're just going to give them an order number. So I want the nav to still be first. So I'm going to say order :1. But then I want the magenta to be second, the blue to be third, and then the footer to be fourth. There we go. So now the pink is before the blue, and that's kind of what our wireframe looked like here. So nice and easy to reorder things. You just want to be specific on each div.